Hey everyone, we're super excited. This is to make sure you know what session you're in. This is the 11 o'clock session for moving beyond lists for tech and techniques to meet voters where they are. I'm Amanda Frankel. I'm the head of client success at Reach. And I'm super excited to be here with Christina, who is one of the best political strategists here in New York, who has done some really awesome work. And so just a little bit about me, and then I'll kick it over to Christina to tell you more about herself. So as I mentioned, I work at Reach, which Reach is, which I'll get more into what it is in a second, but we are provide really awesome organizing tools to progressive campaigns, as well as nonprofits across the country. We're working with over 200 organizations right now nationwide, up and down the ballot, as well as issues from census work and voter registration to labor organizing. And prior to working at Reach, I was a congressional candidate in New York's 10th district. I live in Brooklyn. I really enjoy going to Coney Island when it's open. I know that most people hate Coney Island. I still love Coney Island. And I'm super stoked to be here with Christina. So I'll kick it over to her to introduce herself.
So yeah, awesome. So I'm Christina Gonzalez. I'm a consultant, I suppose. I know it's a dirty word in some circles, but I'm the good kind, I promise. I work on mostly really very progressive challengers campaigns. I'm currently working with a gentleman named Janos Martin, who's running for Manhattan DA. I just got off of a campaign in Jackson Heights, working with Jessica Gonzalez Rojas. We won that one with 42% of the vote in a 5-way race. I'm deeply proud of that. And previously have worked with Jumaane Williams, who is the current public advocate of New York City. And I worked with Zephyr Teachout in her race for Attorney General. I love doing field. It's a strange thing to say that I actually really love going door knocking. So it really bummed me out that I didn't get a chance to do that this election cycle. And having to pivot into something that's digital was a bit of a challenge at first. That was made a little bit easier with the organizing tools that are at our disposal. And a tool that I'm going to show you in a little bit that we kind of invented for this moment, to answer in this moment, that I'm going to use even if we can start knocking doors again. So kicking it back to you, Amanda.
Yeah, sure. So again, just like a little bit about us and general flow of the session. So I work at Reach, and the idea at Reach is that we want to power a world where progressive grassroots activism beats corporate cash. And so what that means is we work with explicitly progressive companies and organizations that are doing really amazing work to power the kind of change that's really necessary, particularly in 2020. And something we found doing this work throughout previous cycles, and in particular now, is that we have to move beyond this traditional idea of canvassing. So I also love door knocking, but canvassing in its core for political campaigns for a long time has meant knocking doors with a pre-cut list of people that you don't already know in a one-off interaction between a volunteer and a voter. But canvassing can mean so much more, and particularly during an age of social distancing, we have to think outside of the box in order to really maintain that strong voter contact that builds deep relationships. So we have to think about doing things like moving beyond doors. Not everyone is at home. A lot of the time when we could door knock in the past, people would be gone because they have multiple jobs to support their family or kids, or they just don't want to answer their door, which is something I faced before here in New York City. And so we want to move beyond those doors to meet people where they're at. And that includes moving beyond lists. A lot of the times when you do go out to doors, you hyper target your lists. You look at people who are triple primes or people who voted for the last 5 elections. And a lot of the times, those are the people who got us into this mess in the first place, right? And so the idea is that by moving beyond lists, we meet communities of voters who are traditionally marginalized by this list cutting process. Voters of color, first-time voters, voters who don't speak English as a first language, voters who are poor, who traditionally don't make it onto that list because they're not triple primes. And also moving beyond strangers. The idea that we can tap into existing networks and communities is a really good way to start building those relationships that build strong inroads for progressive campaigns and organizations. We have a couple stats here that, which should come as no surprise to anyone, that only 13% of people in America trust the media a great deal. and that digital relational outreach can be up to 20 times more effective than stranger-to-stranger GeoTV tactics. And we also want to move beyond those one-off interactions, move beyond a single conversation into a relationship that we truly build, even if it's at a distance, even if it's digital, to continue strong organizing momentum and work that brings real change and real candidates. And so the idea of what we do at Reach is that we built a progressive organizing tool that enables you to do this. Canvas voters wherever they are, continue to manage and build those relationships, and keep everyone excited, including your volunteers, even when organizing at a distance. Don't Worry Today, though, is actually not about what Reach is and what it does, but really about some of the really awesome organizing work that we've gotten to witness and help enable. And that's going to mean we're going to look at two key things. So all these organizations that we talk about, grassroots, strong, progressive organizations, kind of are field-first organizations, right? And so when we're field-first organizations without the field, like Christina mentioned, what do? One is this idea of digital door knocking that Christina invented as a new way to build inroads with new supporters. And the other way is through relational organizing, capturing your existing network and expanding your reach. And number two isn't new, but the way in which we enable it and capture it has really changed a lot. And so with that one, I'm going to kick it over to Christina to tell you more about this amazing strategy she created.
All right. So as I mentioned, this pandemic threw my campaign into disarray a little bit, especially because we all went indoors just as we were going to start knocking doors. We were actually just finishing up petitioning and we had to cut petitioning short. And so, we had to pivot. I had to basically take my entire field strategy and throw it in the garbage, pivot from that and really figure out what are the tools that are at my disposal. And so digital door knocking is actually something that came out of a conversation with Amanda and Jake, also from Reach, this idea of digital door knocking. So traditionally, if I were canvassing out on the street, I'd be trying to figure out where are the people that I want to talk to, where do they congregate, and meeting people where they are. This concept of digital door knocking is basically that same thing, but figuring out where people congregate digitally in this virtual space. So if I want to have a conversation about with someone about an issue that I care about, in this case, my candidate, you'll see this is an actual DM that I would send my candidate. I would sort of figure out who cares about my candidate, Jessica Gonzalez Rojas. So I'd go into her Twitter, figure out who is engaging with her Twitter, who's following her, who's liking her posts, and then DMing them about her to see if they would be interested in volunteering for her campaign. And so a lot of this was just to sort of think outside the box of the different places where people naturally congregate. So I think that this next one is. So these are the questions that I would ask myself to really figure out, how do I build this list of where I could find people and DM them and have these conversations about my candidate or about an issue or whatever it is that I'm trying to do. So part of it is like figuring out, what is it that I'm asking from them? Am I gonna be asking for them to participate in a webinar? What's the webinar about? If it's about, cutting the NYPD budget, that was a fight that was happening, really trying to figure out where are people talking about that issue. So like I'd go to different Twitter groups, different @s, and follow, like looking at their followers and who was engaging with those people's posts, what kind of hashtags they were using to talk about that issue, and following those and just DMing those people. If the ask was something like money for a specific candidate, then obviously I would go to that candidate's followers, because that's a bit more personal and you can't necessarily go outside that box. An exception to that was one of our interns. He's very politically engaged and has a large Twitter following. He talks a lot about police accountability. So he'd go into his Twitter followers who engaged with his posts about police accountability to talk about our candidate. So even if they weren't connected to our candidate, we knew that that would be a natural fit. So that's a bit of what we would do. We would do something similar, obviously, with Instagram and with Facebook. Facebook's a little bit different because Facebook also has groups in a way that Twitter doesn't have groups and Instagram doesn't have groups. So we would look at like neighborhood groups. For example, here there is an Inwood, Washington Heights neighborhood group that I'm a part of where they talk a lot about the issues that are facing this community. And so those are natural fits. Think beyond the candidates' Facebook group and think about what other groups do people sort of formulate to talk about the issues that your candidate likes to talk about. All right, next one. So this is one of the issues that we did. I don't know if y'all were following nationally, but we were trying to cut the NYPD budget by $1 billion this year. The city council is the one that controls that budget. So we did a lot of work with organizations that were making the demand to cut the billion. And we were also doing actions to call our city council candidates. So one of the things that I was doing was working with Communities United for Police Reform and Brooklyn Movement Center, which are two organizations that were leading in this ask to cut this demand, actually, to cut the NYPD budget by $1 billion. And we were fundraising for them. We were trying to get to $10,000 in 1 week. We were $3,000 short by that Friday, which happened to be Juneteenth. So I gathered my little group of people and we took to the Twitter. We went on Friday morning, and it was actually a super fun way to start my day. I sent them this little message that's included here about the organization, what we were trying to do. Obviously, we targeted the followers of Communities United for Police Reform. We targeted the followers of Brooklyn Movement Center, but we also went down the hashtags that people were using in that moment. So that was hashtag, defund the NYPD, defund the police, let's see, NYC budget justice. So there were different hashtags that people were using around that, that we were following. And we actually were able to raise $3,000 that morning. And we were just like chatting each other up and basically copying and pasting this message into a bunch of DMs. Any DMs that were open. Obviously, what made it really easy for us is, especially with Twitter, is that Twitter, in people's bios, it geolocates them. Not everybody has that, but a lot of people do. So that allowed us to sort of be even more targeted than we'd be able to do on something like Instagram. That's a really good question. I don't get marked as spam on Twitter. You do get marked as spam in something like Facebook. So when you send a Facebook message, that does tend to happen. You end up in if they're not someone that you're following or following you back, you end up in like their alternate inbox. And that's kind of what makes Twitter my favorite platform to do this through, because that doesn't happen. They do set limits on the number of people that you can DM at once, but the limits are super, super high. I hope they don't change that if they pay attention to what I'm doing. That would suck. But yeah, so I love Twitter for that. But we do go to Instagram and Facebook to do that with knowing those challenges. All right, next slide. Okay, so I mentioned that I work with Janos Martin, who's running for Manhattan DA. So while obviously I was working with Jessica to get her elected in June, I'm also working with Janos to get him elected next June. The campaign didn't stop. I didn't want it to stop. And this really gave us an opportunity to really scale this concept of digital door knocking up. Because he isn't running for a small little district, it's the whole of Manhattan, talking about an issue that a lot of people are discussing in this moment, really expanded who we can engage in this moment and asking like what we would be asking for. So I would let them know about events that we were having, because we started this little thing called Dinner with Janos. Every Thursday, he attempts to cook a dish while talking about a criminal justice topic with a guest. So depending on the topic, we would do digital door knocking to people who might care about that topic. Or we would always ask at, like, if people actually responded for their emails, because obviously we want to continue having these conversations, and we don't want to have to DM them every single time we have a new event or a new policy drop. So we ask for that email as that next step to continue that conversation. We used it to fundraise small dollars. As I mentioned, my intern went into his followers and to his DMs, and the dude just like DM the shit out of his list and ended up with like raising $2,500 from like his Zoomer buddies. Like, Zoomers don't have money. How did you raise $2,500 in one afternoon, guy? But it speaks to how useful this tool is. And obviously we were using it to get volunteers. So these are two examples of the types of messages that we would send. So one of them, the top one, is around an action that we were doing. So our campaign was also working in conjunction with Communities United for Police Reform to get people to call their council members and push them to say yes to cutting the NYPD budget by $1 billion. So we DM'd a bunch of people one day, and we for the next day's event. I also DM people for different webinars. This one the second message was a webinar with Alex Vitale, who's the author of this amazing book. I promise I'm not getting paid to do this. Everyone should read this, though. This is really important shit. And to get people turned out for that, people who would naturally care about that. Obviously, we slid into the DMs of people who follow Alex, but people who are also having conversations about decarceration, about abolition, and so that's two of the tactics that we were doing. Yeah, that's sort of like the ideal message length. Anything like, because you don't want it to be too long, because then it looks like no one wants to read it. But obviously I want to sort of give a little bit of context, not just like, hey, you want to attend this thing? Sort of like I throw in why I'm messaging them, which is why I said, I noticed you care about. So it isn't just like, who's this person? Why is she messaging me? I create a little bit of that context so they feel a little bit more comfortable. And that actually, I find gives us a really good response rate between the targeting and between the type of message that we send. It gives us a really good response rate. For these two, you'll see that I didn't include the link, because what I do is if I just include the link, my theory is they're just gonna click the link and they have no reason to respond to me. If they're interested, they're like, yes, I'm interested. Then I send them a link, and then it feels more like a conversation. And it gives them more of a reason to actually engage with me. And if they engage with me and saying like, yes, I'm interested, and I send them the link, that also allows me to be like, can you give me your email? Or I want to make sure that it feels like a natural conversation, a natural progression, like I'm someone that they could turn to about a thing. All right, so these are our numbers. You're wondering, does this work? It does. So, this was all theoretical when we said like, let's DM people, let's see if that works. So I started tracking it because, I do field. I love data. Why wouldn't I track that? And so we started to see really quickly how many responses we were getting and like how likely people were to respond. When we first started, it was mostly about digital events. We got a 24% response. Like that's the average. Some people were responding a little bit less. We got up, like some days we got up to 30% response rate. And then the email rate for that. So like once they responded, 50% of those people would give us their emails. So that's like, we ended up with a lot of new emails just from DMing people. and engaging people in these conversations. This also meant that we had, like, week after week, we have new viewers for our Dinner with Janos or whatever webinar we're hosting. Usually, you know, if you're just DMing, if you're emailing your list, you end up with the same people who attend your events. But this DMing, because we're targeting people around a specific issue, we end up with new faces every single week, and we maintain our viewership week over week. Which is something that I think is pretty neat. For something like volunteering, the response rate is also really high because we're targeting people around an issue that they really care about. And something like cutting $1 billion from the NYPD is something that people have an emotional connection to as well. They have an emotional drive to get that thing done. So when they saw that message, like, yeah, fuck yeah, I'm here. So like we had 20 something people show up on a Tuesday morning to DM, to call their council members. You know, it's the moment. It's what people cared about. Now, I will say, if you'll notice that the small dollar fundraising, the response rate was a little bit lower. Part of that is because we were including the link in the message, so they didn't necessarily need to respond if they wanted to donate. The other part of it is when you're asking someone to engage around an issue they really care about, they're more likely to be like, I care about that thing. But if you're just asking them about to donate money, they have less of a reason to respond. However, it was still really useful. We were able to raise over $5,000 in 1 week just from DMing people for the small dollar fundraising. We were asking literally for $5 a piece. Obviously, there were people who were giving more than that, but we were making super low asks. We did $5 because we were DMing people that like we didn't necessarily personally know, or who might not necessarily have known the candidate. But it still felt like, you know, so that it was low commitment, but still something. So we raised a decent amount of money from that. So that's what we did. I think that's it, right? Is there anything else I had to say? Oh, the issues. So Facebook makes it hard for the DM, like you DM people who isn't your friend, it winds up in a completely different inbox. That makes it a little bit of an issue. Instagram does lock you out after a certain number of DMs. And Twitter is really fantastic because it does allow you to geolocate people. So Twitter is my favorite, but obviously sort of like thinking outside the box with Twitter starts to get a little bit harder. That's one issue that we're starting to find with Janos, because obviously we talk a lot about criminal justice reform, so I'm not always gonna, like, using that hashtag is gonna get, I'm gonna run through the same people. So really starting to think outside the box, really like coming into contact with new people to follow, that's a little bit of a challenge in this moment, but it also means that I'm really thinking about this. Is there a good way to track who you've already talked to? That's an excellent question. I don't necessarily do that. When we were DMing for money, we were DMing all of Janos's followers, and we downloaded his list of followers. You can do that and turn that into like an Excel sheet. And we basically assigned those to people. So we made sure that we weren't duplicating the money ask. In terms of duplicating the ask and engagement around different topics, I don't care about that as much, because it means like, oh, this campaign's really like coming out for a lot of issues that I care about, and they're engaging me on a lot of different topics. So I don't mind as much if we are duplicating that kind of effort. I do, however, track people who are aggressive towards our volunteers and our team members. So if there's anybody who says something kind of like offhanded about either the candidate or about the topic, they go into a do not DM list. So that's about it.
Always have to have that do not DM list. And one thing I will throw in as well, as far as tracking who you've talked to, when you get to the stage where you're actually IDing supporters and focusing on a supporter list, we do at Reach, we have worked with Christina on previous campaigns before, and we are working with her on Janos. So we hope that when they're at the AD stage, we'll see all of that data in Reach.
Yeah.
Well, we won't see it. We don't look at her data, but
Right.
the data.
So that's the thing that we're starting now. We're starting to ask people, can we count on your support for Janos, or is this something that you think you would support? That is the next step. So we DM people, and then in my little chart tracking everybody that we've DM'd, have they been added to Reach? So that's a natural next step.
Awesome.
Right.
So the next thing we're going to talk about is relational organizing. So I love listening to Christina talk about digital door knocking, because the last time we did a presentation together on these two things was at Organizing 2.0. And at that point, the conversation was about like creating ideas. And now we're kind of coming back with cases that support those asks. So it's always, I'm also a data person, and I like live in Excel in my free time, which means maybe I need more hobbies. But I love kind of seeing the data come together. And I see a question from Tim about whether Reach works in Canada. We are US only right now. We're really focused on some awesome change in November, but we're always excited to expand to support progressive efforts elsewhere. Right now, we're just here in the US. Cool. And so the other side of the kind of outreach you can do during distancing is relational organizing. So Christina's idea of digital door knocking works really well for garnering new support, building new volunteer bases, getting people involved with the campaign. And then the other side of it is taking advantage of the relationships that are already existing. You know, everybody talks about relational organizing like it's some new fancy idea. And spoiler alert, no, it isn't. Relational organizing is literally the thing that we have all been doing the entire time we've all been organizing, which is using existing relationships in our organizing work to maximize our asks. Things like candidate IDs, recruiting volunteers. It's just kind of what we're kind of thinking about is a new way of capturing those interactions, making them more efficient, and really enabling strong results. But relational organizing isn't new, it's just good organizing. So we're both leveraging our existing relationships, but also building new relationships in our organizing work. So this idea of relational, that you only have to text your same 5 friends over and over about your candidate, is not true. The thing that great organizers do is they build new relationships. Those new relationships become new volunteers who maybe then join a digital door knocking shift or reach out to their friends. And it's the cycle of continuing to build out your personal networks in a way that expands the reach of your organizing work. And so we have kind of the structure we've come up with in conjunction with one of the campaigns we work with as well, about how to kind of conduct successful relational organizing. And one of the things that we have found that's the most successful in this relational outreach, having volunteers utilize their personal networks, is to have a structured time. The same way you would set up a shift to do things like a phone bank or a digital door knock. Set up a time for relational organizing. Instead of putting the pressure on your volunteers to go do this on their own time, have a structure where people can come together. And the same way you would with any other strategy, you want to define a concrete ask. You want your volunteers to understand what they're doing and why. Is the goal candidate IDs? Is the goal to recruit more volunteers to come back to a shift? And then once you have defined that concrete ask, then it's time to set individual volunteer goals. So even if it's the goal of texting 5 friends about the campaign to see if they want to engage, or if every volunteer has a goal of 20 IDs over the course of the month, making sure that you have a concrete goal that people can work towards is incredibly important, as well as having a trackable outreach method. Christina is the queen of spreadsheets. I love spreadsheets too. The way that we track a lot of this relational outreach is in Reach, in our network tool. But the most important thing is that however you're doing this organizing work, you want to make sure you're tracking how these relationships are working. And then the last thing is to make sure that your volunteers know what to say. One of the things that's incredibly powerful is a personal connection to the candidate or to the issues. Christina's DMs were a really good example of helping volunteers know what to say in the context of who they're talking to. But when you're doing that personal outreach, you can also do that context in terms of who you are, in addition to who the person you're speaking with is. I see a question from Lindsay about whether Reach is considered adding in a social DM integration. So we actually, when you message someone using Reach, you can message using another app. So when you tap that button, you get your phone's share sheet where you can choose things like Facebook Messenger or Twitter, or it'll put any app that shows up in either your iOS or Android share sheet is available there. that you can use to do social DMs as well. And so the case I'm going to talk about today is the Mondaire Jones campaign as an example of how this relational can work and succeed, as well as how it can be structured. So Mondaire Jones is the Democratic nominee in New York's 17th Congressional District. Mondaire won his primary on June 23rd, and we are really excited about that. Here in New York, when you win your primary, it's usually a pretty definitive sign that you are going to be the congressperson-elect. And Mondaire's campaign did a really amazing job constructing this outreach in a way that really grew very well. And so their basic structure for their outreach was this idea of friend banks, which we've seen in other reach campaigns before. But when you're organizing at a distance, one of the things is to give your volunteers a place to come together. So they would hold a 2-hour Zoom session where they would do these reach friend banks to do all of this really awesome relational outreach. And their ask for the session was to reach out to 20 people in their network to collect candidate IDs and recruit new volunteers. And they were using Reach for this outreach. And their goal was to ensure that they have personal stories about their support for Mondaire, why they care about the campaign. Because when they're, again, when you're speaking to people you already know, understanding where you stand and why you're engaged is so incredibly important. And so what we're going to kind of do is break down how one of these friend banks worked, how they structured it, how they got their volunteers excited, as well as what some of the outputs were, which, spoiler alert, he won. So we know one of the outputs, which is really exciting. And so the way they would structure a friend bank is kind of in a couple of key stages around both making sure your volunteers are prepped, that they have the right content, and that they know how to do the outreach. So the first thing for them, since they were using Reach, was to have volunteers come prepared with Reach downloaded. So if you are having your volunteers engage with the tech, like for them, they were working with us with Reach, but if they're using any technology at all, make sure your volunteers at least come prepared with an account setup. One of the things that can happen in any kind of relational session or any outreach session in general, like we've all been there on the phone bank where a dialer training goes from 5 minutes to 30 minutes to explain it to everyone as they come in. So making sure people come prepared with the tech. Important than that is creating a sense of excitement about why you're doing this out. When people are gearing themselves up to talk to their own friends and family, or potentially people in their networks they might not know as well, understanding what they're doing and why they're doing it is so important. Like, for example, the Mondaire campaign at this point had like 500 ID volunteers, and they were like, okay, 500 ID volunteers, if every single person gets 20 people in their network, that's 10,000 new IDs. And 10,000 IDs in a primary where the win number was around 33,000 is a significant number of IDs to be able to get. And so once everyone's excited, the next step is to be really purposeful in this outreach. So now we have a contact import tool people can use to match their personal phone contacts to the voter file to conduct the outreach. But when the Mondaire team was starting this outreach, they started with building purposeful lists, brainstorming friends, family, neighbors that they know might engage, actually using similar tactics to what Christina mentioned in digital door knocking, seeing which of your friends on Facebook like the Bernie page or the Elizabeth Warren page, or engage with progressive candidates on Twitter. In addition to thinking about people you know personally, maybe they've volunteered for another campaign, or your neighbors during social distancing have started putting signs up in their windows in support of like the defund the NYPD movement. Thinking about the different ways you can create a purposeful list of people who would be open to hearing about the work that you're doing. The next step that they would do is get everyone actually set up in the tech. So when people come prepared and logged in, it's really important to make sure people know how to use whatever tech they're using. So at that point, they would do a training. And once everyone's trained on the tool is when they'll make sure they've crafted their personal stories. So because they've already brainstormed a really purposeful list of friends and family, people they want to talk out to, that really important list of 20, crafting the personal story becomes easier, and thinking about, why you're doing what you're doing. Like a good example was if one volunteer, if their list of friends, family, and neighbors had 12 out of 20 of them were talking about criminal justice reform, then maybe their personal story, the underlying of that seems to be criminal justice reform, and to focus on that about why you care about that candidate. or about Medicare for all, if the majority of people you're looking at, you're thinking about things like access to healthcare, and really craft your personal story. And so once it's time for that, it is time to reach out. And the way their friend bank's kind of structured, steps 1 through 5 were usually about the first hour of the 2-hour Zoom session. And then the second hour was actually doing that outreach all together live, everyone on mute like you would with a phone bank, to continue to start gathering IDs and getting in contact. And so the results were really cool. They added 7,000 relationships into Reach in 2 months, which started off, it grew kind of exponentially, which I'll show you a graph in just a second. And the really cool thing of that was that they added 7,000 relationships, and around 6,000 of those relationships, or 86%, were ID responses. So because we're thinking about this idea of crafting this personal outreach and reaching out to people you already know, the response rate was significantly higher than any other form of outreach I've ever done. I was shocked when Laura, who worked on the Mondare campaign, said they assessed 6,000 IDs. Now, those are just total ID responses, not necessarily positive IDs, but 6,000 total responses through that personal outreach. And the most important result was that they won their primary. And so the thing that's, I think, really important to think about when doing things like building relational programs is about time investment early on to help it scale over time. So these 7,000 relationships that went into Reach in 2 months really grew exponentially, because as you start in the beginning with the goal of adding IDs and recruiting volunteers, you wind up with more people able to add more relationships. So you can see that they started at end of April through the end of June, and they were really able to grow substantially over time as more people returned to the friend banks, as those conversations got stronger, and then they returned to those lists, those personal networks, during GOTV to make sure people they had ID'd actually do the most important thing, which is show up and vote, or in New York, hopefully mail in their ballots, depending on the district, but that's a talk for another time. And so then the reflection with that really, that I want to hammer home, was the idea of starting early and strong. So relational programs really build over time with time investment. Having specific times where your volunteers can come together and strategize, having specific goals, really keeping it as part of a routine, the same way you would have shifts for anything in canvassing, having shifts for this. And the way you can also make sure it builds over time is holding your volunteers accountable, tracking their outreach, looking at their network of people, see who they've messaged, and following up with them if there's people who have gaps, who haven't messaged their old network. And one thing in retrospect, because the Mondare team was working directly with Reach, was that we did some really good tech improvements that were a little late for the New York primary that probably would have made it more efficient early on. We had released a contact import tool, so they would probably use that earlier on in the cycle to jumpstart their outreach next time around. And so then the last thing is, how do these two strategies work together? Because nothing happens in a vacuum on any campaign, absolutely nothing. And so really the idea of relational organizing and digital door knocking can feed together, because they cover each other's bases. There is no one organizing strategy that will ever get you in contact with all of your voters. Like, there's just not. Anybody who says that there is, I think they're full of it. So the idea is that something like relational can act as a really strong way to do volunteer recruitment, since it's friend to friend. So when you recruit those volunteers through relational, you then send them over to the digital door knocking shift. You send them to get out and send DMs to their new friends to be able to continue that outreach. Or when you recruit excited volunteers through digital door knocking, you get them into the relational program and start adding out to their personal network. And so this idea is that these two strategies, along with other outreach, can kind of feed into each other to continue to really create kind of more robust organizing work. And one thing I want to say as well, just as like a thank you, Christina is an amazing strategist who does a really awesome work. And we are just so appreciative of her coming in to highlight this new strategy she's created. And I also want to give a shout out to the Mondare team, who actually built out this case study that we have here was from a Twitter thread from Laura here on this list. And so Laura and Maya and Elise were a big help in building out this case study and partnering with Reach to make sure that the strategy they used to win was able to be accessible to other people. So we're super thankful for them. And also, if you want to get in touch with either of us, here is our contact information. So this deck will be uploaded. You'll be able to download it, I believe, from the session. But if you want to get in contact with either of us, here's some Twitter information and some emails. We love new organizers. If you wind up in Christina's DMs, you will wind up on a digital door knocking shift. So fair warning. But,
it's true. It's true. I'm glad that you brought up that y'all would do actual sessions for the relational organizing, because we do that for the digital door knocking in the same way that we schedule phone banking sessions and go on to Zoom to do this together virtually. We do the same with the digital door knocking. We were actually for a while watching episodes of Watchmen from one week to the next, so that we'd watch Watchmen while we DM people, and it felt engaging. It's now they're watching Pose on Netflix. But yeah, think of different ways that you get people engaged. I love gamifying a lot of these things. So making note of people of who got the most responses, or who got the most emails, or who put the most number of people into Reach that week. And sort of if you do a Slack or whatever it is that you congregate all of volunteers, giving those people a shout out is super, super important. So yeah, does anybody have any questions? You could put them either in the Q&A or the chat. I'm looking at all of it. Is it user-friendly to less savvy folks? I found that it is. So I used it on Jumani's campaign. And so we were engaging people who are older, and they're people of color who are used to just handing out lit. And it was I don't want to do phone banking. I just want to hand out lit. I'm like, all right, you can hand out lit, but I'm also going to give you this app. And they were using Reach. So I'll say that it's super, super user friendly. The main page is basically I could pull it up right now. It basically just looks like this. It's just a search. Oh boy. And you just put in the person's name, and if you have their address, to look them up, and that's it. Advice for rural.
One thing about tech friendliness as well. So the Reach app you can use on your phone, but there's also a web app you can access through your browser without downloading anything. So especially during social distancing, when people are just in front of their computers more, or with volunteers who might be more comfortable on a computer but not on a smartphone, we have the exact same app is available just through the web for people who might want a little bit of a bigger interface or more comfortable on a computer.
Joel, that is an excellent question, because that's an issue everywhere. That's certainly, I live in Harlem. There are a lot of people who in our communities of color, especially if they are older or whatnot, who don't even have internet connection. So really figuring out how you can find those people and still have these engaging conversations is also part of the equation. Obviously, I don't find them digitally. We've been doing tabling. I find if they are already outside, we sort of see it they're consenting to engaging with people. We're not doing door knocking, because that's different. You're showing up to them without knowing if that's something they're okay with. But if they're outside, one of my friends who's running for city council, she's like, I just go outside and have kikis with people. You have a kiki on their stoop, whatever. So that's a way to do that. So I'm still sort of thinking, where do people congregate naturally in the real world to do tabling, so that they have the option to come to you rather than you just showing up and forcing them into that conversation. So that's sort of what I would recommend. If y'all have farmers markets are fantastic for this. I would do something like that. There's some stores that are opening up where there's always lines. They are a captive audience. Use that. Best practices against volunteers. Go from just posting something in a Facebook to personally DMing people. I mean, I just have them, you know, just I have them show up to our sessions and walk them through that. We always do new volunteer training. I don't know if you mentioned this, but one of the things that we do that I know that the Mondare's team did is when there was someone always assigned to do new volunteer training. So even though that was like a weekly standing thing that you did with like either relational organizing or us with digital door knocking, so there were always like, we had the same people, so we want them to get going, but there was someone new almost every week. We do little breakout groups, and which are really easy to do on Zoom. And we train people, get them comfortable having these conversations. And because we sort of like craft those DMs, it's really easy to just send it. And one of the things that I tell people is if you DM them and they respond, you've lost nothing. You've lost literally nothing. It costs you nothing. So like, why not just give it a shot, you know? I think that once people get into the conversation, they get used to it, and they find that it's actually quite fun and engaging. I don't know if we're gonna get kicked off, but it's supposed to end now at 11:50. Any last minute questions before we get kicked off? Geolocation on Twitter. Oh, great question. So one way is just basically like when you click on their profile, it'll say, like mine says Manhattan, some people say Brooklyn or whatever it is. Or when you do a search for a keyword, you can actually say like near me. So like all the people who are talking about that keyword or that hashtag near me, that's one way to do that. So that's a really easy way to do that on Twitter. The other way that I do it also is just like thinking of organizations that are based in my neighborhoods. Chances are the people who follow them are also in those neighborhoods. Okay, any other questions? Done. If there aren't any other questions, obviously you have my Twitter handle. If you think of anything else, DM me. I will answer that. I practice what I preach. If I'm going to DM people and expect people to respond to me, I do the same back. So I'm not going to be an asshole. You can DM me. I think, and my email too, if you wanted to like have a longer conversation, is there.
Cool. Yeah. Again, just thank you, everyone. We know that like the world is on fire all the time now, and there's like conflicting organizing priorities that everyone is doing. So we're glad that we were able to kind of take some time to go through this with you. And there's a question about sharing the slides. I'm going to upload the slides. We can actually upload them, I believe, to our presentation time, if that's correct. Which my host will hopefully confirm. But there is a way for me to upload the slides so they can be accessed by everyone.
All right. Well, that's it, right? Is that it?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you guys so much for joining us. And that's it. Have a great Friday. Enjoy whatever the weather is doing where you are. Okay, we're done.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
I actually have a question, if you can wait a sec.
Yeah, no problem.
I figured I'd let them. Okay. I was trying to let all the just a plug from a tech person, and I was checking while you guys were on the thing. Um, to her point about how you update Reach, I would love to see you guys on Zapier. Are you familiar with that? Oh, I can't.
Sorry, I'm having a whole conversation with myself. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So we do have the ability to use webhooks. We're not technically, like, we're not in the Zapier dropdown, but you can still use Zapier to interact with Reach through webhooks.
Okay.
It requires one of their like custom webhook options. We
Okay.
are looking at becoming one of the apps. So our current webhook setup doesn't include the same level of granularity available through things like our data exports or scheduled automated exports, but you
Okay.
can still use it through one of the custom integrations with Zapier.
Okay. That's good to know. I'm a part of what I do for campaigns is set up these platforms and then set up Zapier and automations and whatever else just to help. People don't always understand that they don't all talk to each other as easily as they would like them to or think they should, or all those kind of things. And sometimes it's translating data. Different systems use different formats, different whatever, and people are like, oh, I thought they think there's like one magic button that just does it, and turns out it doesn't quite work that way. So
no, it doesn't. Also, it is still recording now, so I don't know if this is going to wind up in the session tape, but I think that's fine.
That's fine.